Sun Tzu said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." Indeed, why not just buy them out? Business is war by other means, to paraphrase Clausewitz. Spend money rather than lives. It's cheaper in the long run. So what can Chinese cash buy? China, the loan shark of the world? Well, one day it just might want its money back with interest. So join me, Jan Darasz, on how we got here.
What constitutes diplomatic influence? In an era where every uncalculated military move carries a risk of swift nuclear retribution, global superpowers are more wary of engaging in direct conflict, instead opting for expanding their zones of influence in more subtle ways. It seems like China has been using its vast financial capabilities to engage other countries in what experts call debt trap diplomacy. A fitting example would be Africa. The continent has been a focus of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, a project launched in 2013 to recreate the historic Silk Road and simultaneously extend China's geopolitical and economic influence. According to estimates, China provided $170 billion to Africa from the year 2000 to 2022. Similar is the situation in Europe. Montenegro is struggling to pay off a $1 billion Chinese loan for a highway project, which has put the country in a dire financial situation. Moreover, the European Union's focus on the successful implementation of the Green Deal in every of its member states allowed China to further involve itself in the affairs of the bloc. Despite the EU tightening its stance towards China due to the latter's continuing expansion in the green e-mobility sector, Chinese-Hungarian relations have entered a renaissance. For instance, the Fudan University of Shanghai is expected to open a $1.8 billion worth campus in Hungary in 2024, which will be the first Chinese university campus in Europe. Moreover, ongoing investments by Chinese giants are set to turn Hungary into a manufacturing hub for Chinese electric vehicles in Europe and one of the world's leading producers of lithium-ion batteries. Hungary's political and economic openness has allowed China to partially mitigate the negative effects of its rivalry with the EU. China's leader, Xi Jinping, is expected to visit Europe in May, and despite the stops not being official yet, many expect him to visit France, Serbia and Hungary. It seems like China is not keen to drop its interest in the old continent.
Our guest today is Dr. Marcin Przychodniak, a political analyst at the Asia and Pacific Programme at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you again. If you go to a loan shark or one of these payday credit companies on the high street, they'll give you a loan or money or credit at the very low interest rates, and then they start to ramp up the interest rate and you're theirs forever, as it were. Is that a brutal way of describing Chinese policy in the Western Balkans, or is it a more subtle way?
Yeah, I think it's a bit more sophisticated than just raising the interest rates or using up the advantages because of the capital, having capital and lending it. I mean, they tend to use up the opportunities. So it's not that they are predatories in terms of, they're looking for opportunities. They use up the opportunities that came from the countries in the Western Balkans. So if there's a country which is interested in Chinese money or, generally speaking, in Chinese involvement in infrastructure building or any other economic cooperation, then they do tend to offer something which is valuable from their perspective, of course, but that can, sometimes change the situation on the ground. So the country which is interested, the Western Balkan countries, can use up Chinese money to build up the infrastructure they need, which they have problems to actually get the capital or the involvement from the Western companies.
Is that so? Is it cost in the final analysis that drives Chinese investment or the acceptance of Chinese investment? Because there's Montenegro recently cancelled this hedging deal with Western banks. Why did it do that? Was that just a pure lower cost basis, or was there an ideological element to it? Was there a pragmatic element to it?
I mean, cost is important. I mean, the profit and the the economic calculations from the Chinese perspective are important, but there is always a strategic element in that, and especially in the Western Balkans. But I think the general debate tends to overestimate this aspect, and in terms of how China's trying to build up its presence in the Western Balkans because of these strategic reasons. They are important, but they are not as important as people tend to think, I believe, especially if you compare it to the actual presence of the EU entities, of the EU institutions, EU itself, of the EU member states. It's still, in terms of sums or in terms of general amount, it's still much more if you look at the EU than when you look at the Chinese involvement. So the strategic aspect is there for sure.
So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is does the strategy drive these investments or the other way around? So we have this Belt and Road Initiative, which seems on the map to be linking Chinese connections to Europe. Has that been planned, or is that as you say, the result of a series of pragmatic investment choices, or a bit of both?
It's a bit of both, but I think there is much more of strategy there, much more of politics there, as it is with all the Chinese involvement abroad, which has to be orchestrated and has to be accepted at least by the party and has to fit the Chinese political interests and ideas. So there's nothing like. I mean, sorry, let me rephrase it. China's economic presence abroad is always a very important part of political attitude there. There is always. So you cannot, being a Chinese company, you have to take it into consideration that your activities abroad, especially when, I'm not talking about the so-called state-owned companies, because that's obvious there, but if you're a private Chinese company which is interested in making business abroad, you have to take into considerations what are the Chinese plans in that particular part of the world, especially in Western Balkans, when the EU neighborhood. That's quite important. What kind of relations China has with these different countries there, what kind of relations China has with the EU, and how your presence, your business presence there, may impact or may be part of this relationship. So if you mentioned Belt and Road, this was an obvious example of how the politics how the economy is being used in politics, and so because that was generally political plan. With economic instruments.
We've got these high-level strategic decisions being made and executed. What's the likely effect on a place such as Montenegro, for example?
Well,
socially.
I mean, you have a lot of.
Or does that even matter?
It does. It does matter because I mean there are many sides in it, many different pictures there. On one hand, of course, Montenegro has problems, or countries like Montenegro, we can use it as an example, it has problems with acquiring capital, and it has a lot of needs in terms of infrastructure and different, and generally developing the country, right? So it uses up the opportunities which arise, and here comes China. And so, on one hand, it's quite positive. They cannot get money from the Western entities, as I said. I mean, from German business people or generally EU, they use up the Chinese opportunities. On the other hand, as I said, there are a lot of controversies there. Chinese don't usually come with plans to develop the region or the country itself. They lend money, they build up with Chinese companies, and then they leave. And so it's not very profitable from the perspective of jobs or any kind of technological development or sharing the technologies or sharing. So that's the other part of the picture, and sometimes also it creates this situation when you get more involved with China, when you get linked to China in terms of accepting Chinese investment, strengthening the cooperation with China makes you sometimes more vulnerable to then Chinese political suggestions or the cooperation on the political side.
I mean, that's probably more acute in places in areas like the academic world or the intellectual world, where China probably does have, I'd say, a malevolent influence. Perhaps is too much, but it does have its interests at heart more so than in building a road bridge, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a complicated picture. Yes, sure. There's a lot of different layers there. I mean, in case of Western Balkans, it's probably much more generally about the infrastructure because of the needs there. But it also depends on the country which we are talking about. I mean, it's a region, but situations are different there.
What's the picture like in Hungary then? We see the Chinese influence in the academic university area there. How do you rate that?
I mean, it depends which perspective are you looking from. Because if you look from the Hungarian perspective, or maybe not Hungarian, but specifically Prime Minister Orbán and his political environment, so to speak, circle, that's on one hand, it's also it's a way to leverage the policy with China and Russia. We shouldn't forget that they also do the same with Russia.
Yes.
To leverage against the European Union to some extent. On the other hand, it's also a way to actually get richer, simply speaking, because of the obvious economic model, which is in Hungary. And to some extent also it makes Hungary as an important country from the perspective of the different sectors, economic sectors in Europe, and taking into account its connections with the German not only but generally mobility and car industry, it's quite important. If you look at the statistics, there never has been quite a lot of Chinese investment in Central Europe generally, but Hungary was the leader for many years, but also in terms of general numbers, it wasn't much. But right now, if you look at the statistics, because of the a lot of different investments from China in the electromobility sector, the batteries, but not only them, but the announcements about how Chinese would like to build their factories, building electric cars there. The numbers went up and quite extraordinary. So this is something that should be observed, especially in its whole general discussion what to do with the Chinese electric cars in the European Union, right? When you have probably a notion that we cannot stop it. I mean, there's no way we can actually we can actually deal with the Chinese let me rephrase it. I mean, we cannot stop it. We have to cooperate with China on the electric cars. We cannot just simply ban the Chinese electric cars in Europe, in the EU, if we want to have the green transformation, if we want to have the electromobility sector. But there's a way how to use it, and you have different voices. You have voices in France saying that we need to convince Chinese, force Chinese, in order to share the technology and in order to actually use up their presence in the European market in that sector. But there's a lot of different, not misunderstandings, but actually lack of knowledge of what the Hungarian position will be on that. I mean, whether Hungary will simply allow Chinese to build up their factories without any preconditions, or they will stand up with the EU in general to actually use up this opportunity. For a lot of years, it's been like that. The European investment was possible on the Chinese market only when you had a joint venture with a Chinese company. China has been using up European technologies on its own market through that process. Now it's kind of the opportunity for the EU to reverse this process and to use up Chinese technologies in the electromobility sector, allowing Chinese companies to do business in Europe, in the EU market, but with conditions.
Have we been, not necessarily naive, but have we been just too slow in relation to Chinese practices and markets, which are very sharp, very effective, very clever? Are we just jealous of Chinese entrepreneurialism?
No, I mean, this is a Chinese model which we kind of avoided to deal with for many years, and we would need to define what is we, because there are different we's here. I mean, you have a Germany we, which tends to, you know, tend to use up this opportunity, thinking that, okay, China has advantages, but we have such good cooperation. I mean, sticking to the car industry, we can use up the opportunity for German companies. Even if China has some advantages, we can still use up the Chinese market, and we can still sell our premium cars on the Chinese market. It would not hurt our industry, which is, I think, wrong right now. And we can clearly see that it doesn't really work well for the German, or it will not in the future. I mean, so there are a lot of different we's here. I mean, Central Europe wasn't really thinking that way, because we didn't really have that kind of cooperation. I mean, that kind of products, that kind of industries, which very much are or were dependent on cooperation with China. So there are different we's here, but I think we as a European Union here, I mean, for many years we used up this opportunity of Chinese market, not thinking about the consequences which arise from the Chinese model, which is to pick up different sectors, subsidize it with a lot of money, build up the sectors internally. I mean, of course, and so we have plenty of Chinese companies in different sectors. I mean, generally the green energy sectors, but electromobility, robotics right now. So they are building their position with subsidies, and they go abroad, and they are quite good in competing because of the...
A final short question to you. Is there a danger of China overextending itself or mortgaging its future on countries which may not be able to pay back the investment that it supplies to them?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it is, and I think Chinese government authorities are aware of that problem. If you look at the statistics, the general amount of money they lend to so-called global south or the developing countries, it's not raising. It's going down because out of many reasons. One of them is the economic problems they have with capital, for example. But the other one is that they do know that that they have a lot of problems with taking capital back.
We have to leave it there, unfortunately. Dr. Marcin Przychodniak, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today, so join us next time on How We Got Here.